April 15, 1943. The skies above the occupied French coast at Abbeville. Oberleutnant Klaus Hoffmann scanned the horizon from the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190. The morning sun breaking through scattered clouds at 12,000 feet. He had flown 63 combat missions and survived the Konelkampf, the grinding air war over the Channel. His squadron had intercepted American bomber formations before, chasing off their escort fighters with relative ease. The Spitfires turned tight, but lacked endurance. The P-38 Lightnings were fast but fragile. Today's radar report mentioned a new type, something the intelligence officers called the P-47, but the briefing had been dismissive. It was supposedly a massive, bloated machine, better suited to ground attack than air combat.
Hoffmann spotted
Them now, 7 contacts at 10 o'clock high, descending in a loose finger four formation. They looked absurdly large, like flying bathtubs with wings, their bulbous fuselages catching the light. He felt a flicker of confidence and signaled his wingman to engage. The enemy fighters should be easy prey. Then the lead P-47 rolled inverted, and Dove and Hoffmann realized with cold certainty that something was terribly wrong. The American came at him not with the tentative caution of earlier escort types, but with shocking, brutal speed. Before Hoffmann could react, the air around his canopy erupted in a storm of tracer fire. 8 streams of 50 caliber rounds converged on his position, each weapon spitting 600 rounds per minute, the combined weight of fire enough to saw a fighter plane in half. His wingman disintegrated in a flash of orange flame. Hoffmann threw his Focke-Wulf into a desperate spiral, pulling 7 Gs, his vision tunneling to gray. But the American stayed with him, pouring lead into the sky with terrifying persistence. He would survive this encounter, barely, but the lesson was burned into his memory. The Americans had brought something new to the European war, and the laughter in the ready rooms would end today. By early 1943, the United States 8th Air Force faced an existential crisis over the skies of Nazi-occupied Europe. American strategic doctrine demanded daylight precision bombing, striking at the industrial heart of the Third Reich with massive formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. But the cost was staggering. During the August 17, 1943, raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the 8th Air Force lost 60 heavy bombers in a single day, with another 600 aircrew killed or captured. The problem was brutally simple. Existing American escort fighters lacked the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany. The P-38 Lightning could reach the German border, but suffered mechanical failures in the frigid high-altitude environment. Over Europe, the P-51 Mustang, equipped with the Merlin engine, would eventually solve this problem, but in early 1943 it remained months away from operational deployment. The Royal Air Force Spitfire, while magnificent in the turning fight, could barely reach Paris before its fuel tanks ran dry. German interceptors, particularly the Focke-Wulf 190 and the improved Messerschmitt Bf 109G, massacred unescorted bomber streams with near impunity. Luftwaffe pilots developed systematic tactics, attacking in waves from the front quarter where the B-17s mounted fewer defensive guns, then peeling away before the formation's massed fire could respond effectively. Between June and October, 1,943 bomber losses averaged nearly 6% per mission, a rate that, if sustained, meant complete crew replacement every 17 missions. The air crews called it a death sentence. Strategic bombing hung in the balance, and with it, the entire Allied plan to cripple German war production before the invasion of France. What was desperately needed was a fighter that could escort the bombers all the way to the target and back, absorb punishment, and fight its way through the Luftwaffe's defenses. That fighter was already arriving in England, but few believed it would succeed. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was born from a radical design philosophy that prioritized firepower, protection, and performance over traditional notions of fighter agility. When the prototype first flew on May 6, 1941, it weighed over 12,000 pounds empty, nearly twice the weight of contemporary European fighters. At its core sat the massive Pratt & Whitney R2-800 double Wasp radial engine, an 18-cylinder, powerhouse generating 2,000 horsepower and cooled by a sophisticated turbocharger system. The turbocharger mounted in the rear fuselage compressed thin air at high altitude and fed it back to the engine, allowing the Thunderbolt to maintain full power above 25,000 feet, where most enemy fighters began to wheeze and lose performance. This gave the P-47 a critical advantage in the vertical fight. It could dive faster than anything in the sky, reaching speeds above 500 miles per hour, and climb rapidly when operating in its optimal altitude band.
Height.
The armament was unprecedented. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, with 400 rounds per gun for the inboard weapons and 300 rounds for the outboard pair. The total weight of fire reached approximately 100 pounds per second when all 8 guns fired simultaneously. It's enough to disintegrate a light bomber or shred a single-engine fighter in a 2-second burst. Each 50 caliber round carried tremendous kinetic energy, capable of punching through aluminum airframes, engine blocks, and even light armor plating. The guns were harmonized to converge at 300 yards, creating a cone of destruction where tracer rounds showed the pilot exactly where his bullets flew. Protection matched firepower. The cockpit sat behind thick armor plate, and the pilot's seat was backed by half an inch of steel. Self-sealing fuel tanks, a lesson learned from early war losses, prevented catastrophic fires from small-caliber strikes. Critical systems were duplicated or armored. The result was a fighter that could absorb battle damage that would have downed lighter aircraft and still bring its pilot home, the P-47. Thunderbolt flew its first combat mission over Europe on March 10, 1943. When the 4th Fighter Group, unit composed largely of former Royal Air Force Eagle Squadron pilots, launched a fighter sweep from Debden Airfield in England. The mission was cautious and uneventful. Shallow penetration over the French coast designed to familiarize pilots with their new mounts. Early operations revealed teething problems. Pilots complained about poor rearward visibility due to the large fuselage, and the cockpit grew unbearably cold at altitude because the heating system malfunctioned. The aircraft's tremendous weight made it sluggish in low-speed turning engagements. And several pilots returned from early missions convinced the Thunderbolt would never match the nimble German fighters in a dogfight. But on April 15, 1943, the day Oberleutnant and Hoffmann encountered the P-47S over Abbeville, everything changed. The 78th Fighter Group engaged elements of Jagdgeschwader 26. In a savage running battle that stretched from 12,000 feet down to the deck, Captain Charles London scored the P-47's first confirmed aerial victory, blasting a Focke-Wulf 190 out of formation with a concentrated burst from his 850s. 2 more German fighters fell in quick succession. The engagement lasted less than for minutes, but the psychological impact reverberated through both air forces. American pilots discovered that while the Thunderbolt turned poorly, it excelled in slashing attacks. Diving from altitude with tremendous speed, delivering devastating fire, then using its superior high-speed performance to climb back to safety before the enemy could respond. German pilots, accustomed to dictating the terms of engagement, found themselves unable to escape the diving Americans or catch the Thunderbolts as they climbed away. The Focke-Wulf 190, previously the terror of the European skies, lost its speed. Advantage above 20,000 feet, where the P-47's turbocharger delivered maximum performance. In the weeks that followed, Thunderbolt squadrons pushed deeper into occupied Europe, extending the protective umbrella over the bomber formations and forcing the Luftwaffe to adapt or die. German intelligence officers initially dismissed the P-47 as an ungainly ground attack aircraft, a perception reinforced by the Thunderbolt's bulky silhouette and radial engine. Luftwaffe fighter pilots, trained in the energy fighting tactics perfected during the Spanish Civil War and refined over Poland, France, and Russia, assumed the massive American fighter would be easy meat in turning combat. This confidence shattered rapidly during April and May of 1943 as combat reports accumulated. Pilots returning from engagements over France described American fighters that dove faster than anything they had previously encountered, absorbed extraordinary amounts of battle damage, and delivered crippling firepower in brief, brutal passes. A captured Luftwaffe intelligence report from June 1943, recovered after the war, noted with alarm that the P-47 represented a fundamental shift in American fighter doctrine. Prioritizing protection and striking power over traditional maneuverability, the report concluded that German pilots could no longer rely on superior turning performance to defeat American escorts. Several Luftwaffe aces, including the legendary Adolf Galland, studied captured gun camera footage from downed P-47s and were shocked by the concentrated firepower and the persistence of American pilots who pressed attacks into effective range. Before opening fire, Galland himself noted in his combat diary that the Thunderbolt forced German fighter units to abandon their preferred tactic of head-on passes against bombers, because the American escorts now contested that airspace with overwhelming firepower. By July 1943, Luftwaffe operational orders explicitly warned pilots to avoid prolonged engagements with P-47s above 20,000 feet, and to never attempt to outdive the American fighters. Instead, German pilots were instructed to engage at lower altitudes where the Thunderbolt's performance decreased, or to attack bomber formations during the brief windows when escorts turned back to refuel, but those windows were closing. In August 1943, the arrival of external drop tanks extended the P-47's combat radius to 375 miles, pushing the escort umbrella to the German border and beyond. The Luftwaffe's defensive advantage was eroding. The veterans knew it. The scale of P-47 production embodied American industrial power at its absolute zenith. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, New York, employed over 25,000 workers operating around the clock in 3 shifts, turning out Thunderbolts with assembly line precision. At peak production in 1944, the factory delivered 1 complete P-47 every 63 minutes, a rate that would have seemed impossible before the war. Curtiss-Wright Corporation opened a second production line in Buffalo, adding thousands more aircraft to the total. By the end of 1943, over 4,000 Thunderbolts had been delivered to combat units in Europe and the Pacific, and production continued to accelerate. The cost per aircraft dropped from approximately $83,000 in 1942 to under $60,000 by 1944. As manufacturing techniques improved and suppliers ramped up component production, this industrial output dwarfed German production of the Focke-Wulf 190, which peaked at approximately 900 aircraft per month across all variants. The logistical challenge of deploying and maintaining such a complex aircraft overseas was staggering. Each P-47 required specialized turbocharger maintenance, constant attention to the R2800 engine's 18 cylinders, and a steady supply of 50 caliber ammunition. A single fighter group operating 3 squadrons consumed roughly 250,000 rounds of ammunition per month during intensive operations. Transport ships carried disassembled Thunderbolts across the Atlantic in convoy, where they were reassembled at depots in England, then ferried to operational airfields. Ground crews worked in frigid, muddy conditions to keep the fighters flying, often repairing battle damage overnight so the aircraft would be ready for the next day's mission. The supply chain stretched from mining operations in the United States that extracted raw materials through factories producing everything from propeller blades to gun sights, across submarine-infested waters, and finally to the frontline squadrons. This system, refined and expanded throughout 1943 and 1944, represented a triumph of logistics as significant as any battlefield victory. The Germans could not match it, and they knew their defeat was being manufactured in the factories of Detroit and Long Island as surely as it was being fought in the skies over Europe. The true test of the P-47 Thunderbolt came during the savage air battles over Germany in the autumn of 1943. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force launched its second raid on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt, a target buried deep in southern Germany beyond the range of any previous escort fighter. The mission plan called for 291 heavy bombers to strike the factories in broad daylight, knowing that Luftwaffe interceptors would rise in massive numbers to defend this critical industrial target. The P-47 groups provided escort as far as their fuel allowed, shepherding the bombers across occupied France and into Western Germany before their drop tanks ran dry and they were forced to turn back. The bombers pressed on alone, and the slaughter began immediately. German fighters attacked in waves, concentrating their fire on individual bombers and systematically destroying the formations. 60 B-17s fell from the sky, burning and spinning earthward, trailing black smoke, taking 600 crewmen with them. The survivors who reached Schweinfurt dropped their bombs through murderous flak and turned for home. But on the return leg, a salvation of sorts appeared. Fresh P-47 squadrons had staged forward, landing at advanced bases to refuel, then launching to meet the returning bombers at the maximum possible range. The 56th Fighter Group, led by Colonel Hubert Zemke, intercepted the formation over the Rhine River and tore into the pursuing German fighters with ferocious intensity. Major Gerald Johnson scored 3 confirmed kills in a single engagement, his 850s shattering a Messerschmitt 109 in a head-on pass, then reversing to flame to Focke-Wulf 190s attempting to dive away. The Thunderbolts escorted the survivors home, fighting a running battle across 200 miles of hostile airspace. The mission was still a strategic disaster, the losses unsustainable. But the returning bomber crews credited the P-47 pilots with saving dozens of aircraft that would have otherwise been lost. The lesson was clear. The Thunderbolt could fight and win deep inside Germany, but it needed more range. Engineers responded by developing larger external tanks and refining fuel management procedures, progressively extending the escort radius throughout late 1943 and into 1944. Until by D-Day, the P-47 could reach targets anywhere in occupied Europe. Psychological impact of the P-47's firepower extended far beyond simple mathematics of rounds per minute and kinetic energy. German pilots learned to recognize the distinctive sound of 850 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously, a sustained ripping roar that differed fundamentally from the higher-pitched chatter of rifle caliber weapons or even the slower thump of cannon. Luftwaffe veterans reported that this sound, once heard, became impossible to forget and induced a visceral fear reaction in subsequent engagements. The visible effects amplified this terror. When a 2-second burst from a P-47 struck an enemy aircraft, the target often simply disintegrated in midair, transformed from a functioning war machine into a cloud of debris and fluttering metal fragments. Pilots who survived being hit by 50 caliber fire described the impacts as sledgehammer blows that shook the entire airframe, puncturing fuel tanks, severing control cables, and shattering cockpit instruments. The tracer rounds, loaded in a ratio of 1 tracer to every 5 ball rounds, created brilliant streams of light that showed exactly where the bullets flew, allowing precise aiming but also creating a terrifying visual spectacle for those on the receiving end. German pilots began to avoid engaging P-47s, lest they possessed overwhelming numerical superiority or a significant altitude advantage. This hesitation translated directly into improved bomber survival rates. When Thunderbolts escorted a formation, Luftwaffe interceptors often chose to shadow the bombers at a distance rather than press home attacks, waiting for the escorts to leave before striking. American bomber crews could see the distinctive profile of the P-47s weaving above their formations, drew tremendous psychological comfort from their presence. Morale reports from bomber groups consistently cited escort effectiveness as a primary factor in crew confidence. The knowledge that the Thunderbolts would fight to protect them, absorb punishment, and exact terrible revenge on attacking fighters transformed the psychological calculus of the daylight bombing campaign. The Germans were no longer hunting helpless prey. They were entering contested airspace where every attack risked a counterattack. From fighters that could kill them with contemptuous ease, this shift in momentum, subtle but profound, marked a turning point in the air war over Europe, as the P-47 secured air superiority over Western Europe throughout 1944. Its role evolved dramatically from pure fighter to devastating fighter-bomber. The Thunderbolt's rugged construction and powerful engine made it ideally suited for ground attack missions, a capability that had been present from the design stage but underutilized during the early air superiority battles. In March 1944, 8th and 9th Air Force P-47 groups began systematic attacks on German transportation networks, targeting railroad yards, bridges, and road convoys in preparation for the invasion of Normandy. Each Thunderbolt could carry up to 2,500 pounds of external ordnance, typically deployed as either 2,000-pound bombs, as 3 500-pound bombs, or 10 5-inch high-velocity rockets mounted on underwing rails. The combination of heavy bomb load and 850 caliber machine guns made the P-47 a terrifying ground attack platform. During Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion beginning June 6, 1944, Thunderbolts flew continuous ground attack missions over the beachheads, striking German armored columns attempting to reinforce the coastal defenses. Pilots developed tactics specifically for destroying German tanks, diving at steep angles to fire rockets into the thin top armor, then pulling up and strafing supply trucks and troop concentrations with their machine guns. The famous Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944 demonstrated the P-47's ground attack prowess with horrifying clarity. German 7th Army units, attempting to escape the Allied encirclement, streamed eastward through a narrow corridor between American and British forces. P-47 groups from the 9th Air Force descended on the trapped columns in relays, bombing and strafing for hours until the roads became impassable graveyards of burning vehicles and dead horses. German survivors described the experience as apocalyptic. With attacks coming in waves from dawn until dusk, the American fighters seemingly immune to the desperate flak fire thrown up by the retreating columns. General Omar Bradley later called it the most devastating air attack of the European War. The P-47 units suffered losses, primarily from ground fire, but the combination of armor protection and rugged construction meant that damaged aircraft often returned to base with dozens of holes punched through wings and fuselage. Testament to the design's survivability. Despite its formidable capabilities, the P-47 Thunderbolt possessed significant limitations that dictated how it could be employed effectively. The aircraft's enormous weight, over 14,000 pounds, when fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, created severe penalties in low-altitude maneuverability. Below 10,000 feet, where the turbocharger provided little benefit and engine power dropped, the Thunderbolt became sluggish and vulnerable to lighter, more agile opponents. German pilots quickly learned to drag American fighters down to the deck where the Focke-Wulf 190's superior low-altitude performance could dominate. Several P-47 pilots died in the early months of operations because they accepted turning fights at low altitude and were simply outmaneuvered and shot down. Training evolved to emphasize disciplined energy tactics. Instructing pilots to maintain altitude advantage, make slashing attacks, and disengage vertically rather than attempting sustained turning engagements. The cockpit ergonomics also drew criticism. Pilots complained about poor visibility to the rear quarters, a potentially fatal blind spot in combat. The solution came in the form of the bubble canopy P-47D variant, introduced in summer 1944, which replaced the original Razorback fuselage with a clear view canopy providing 360-degree visibility. This modification dramatically improved situational awareness and combat effectiveness. Range remained a persistent challenge until adequate external fuel tanks became available. Early paper composition drop tanks often failed to feed fuel properly, or broke apart during high-speed maneuvers, forcing pilots to jettison them prematurely and curtailing mission radius. By December 1943, improved metal drop tanks solved these problems. But the transition period saw numerous missions aborted or shortened due to fuel system malfunctions. Maintenance demands were substantial. Complex turbocharger system required constant attention, and the R2800 engine, while reliable, demanded meticulous maintenance to prevent cylinder fouling and oil system failures. Ground crews worked exhausting hours to maintain operational readiness rates and spare parts shortages, occasionally grounded entire squadrons. Yet despite these limitations, the P-47's fundamental design remained sound. Adaptations, addressing each weakness, transformed a good fighter into a superb one, while the P-47 Thunderbolt gained fame over Europe. It also served with distinction. In the Pacific theater, though in smaller numbers and with less publicity, the 5th Air Force began receiving P-47Ds in late 1943, deploying them to bases in New Guinea to supplement the P-38 Lightning in long-range escort and ground attack missions. The Pacific environment posed unique challenges. The vast distances between island bases and Japanese targets demanded maximum range, and the P-47's fuel consumption at low altitude made it less ideal than the P-38 for overwater missions. However, in ground attack and close-air support roles, the Thunderbolt excelled brilliantly. During the Philippines campaign, beginning October 1944, P-47 groups provided critical air support for advancing American infantry, destroying Japanese bunkers, artillery positions, and supply depots with devastating accuracy. The aircraft's ability to absorb punishment proved invaluable over targets defended by intense anti-aircraft fire. Unlike lighter fighters that could be knocked down by a single 20mm shell, the P-47 routinely returned from missions with battle damage that would have been fatal to other aircraft. Pilots reported flying home with cylinders shot out of the radial engine, control surfaces shredded, and hydraulic systems destroyed. The Thunderbolt's rugged construction keeping them alive. In China, the 14th Air Force operated P-47S against Japanese forces from primitive airstrips carved out of mud and rock. These units faced severe logistical constraints. Every gallon of fuel and every .50 caliber round flown over the Himalayas from India at tremendous cost and effort. Despite these challenges, P-47 pilots flew ground attack missions against Japanese railroads, bridges, and river traffic, interdicting supply lines and supporting Chinese ground forces. The final Pacific combat missions for the P-47 came in August 1945, during the closing days of the war, striking targets in Japan itself and supporting the planned invasion that ultimately never occurred. While the P-47 never achieved the iconic status in the Pacific that it held in Europe, its contributions to victory in the Far East were substantial and demonstrated the aircraft's versatility across vastly different operational environments. The P-47 Thunderbolt's contribution to Allied victory extended far beyond individual combat actions or tactical engagements. By mid-1944, the aircraft had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the air war over Europe. Heavy bomber losses, which had averaged catastrophic rates during the autumn of 1943, dropped precipitously as escort coverage extended deeper into Germany. During the first quarter of 1944, bomber loss rates fell below 2% per mission, a sustainable figure that allowed the 8th Air Force to maintain continuous pressure on German industrial targets. This was the strategic bombing campaign, fulfilling its intended purpose, and the P-47 made it possible. The Luftwaffe, forced to contest every bomber raid against swarms of Thunderbolts, bled experienced pilots at an unsustainable rate. German fighter pilot training programs, already truncated by fuel shortages and the demands of multiple fronts, could not replace the veterans lost in combat over the Reich by D-Day. June 6, 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was absolute. German pilots simply could not contest the overwhelming numbers of American fighters, and those who tried often died in their first engagements against experienced Thunderbolt squadrons. The ground attack missions flown by P-47S after the Normandy invasion crippled German mobility, destroying trucks, tanks, and railroads faster than they could be replaced. General Dwight Eisenhower credited tactical air power, delivered primarily by P-47s and P-51s, as a decisive factor in the rapid Allied advance across France. The economic impact was equally significant. Every P-47 that returned damaged but repairable represented a victory of industrial capacity over attrition. The Germans could not match American production, and they could not replace losses at American rates. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe had essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force over Western Europe. Its remnants husbanded for desperate defense of the homeland or thrown away in futile attacks against overwhelming Allied numbers. The P-47 had not won the war alone, but it had provided the shield under which strategic bombing broke German industry and tactical air power shattered German armies. That contribution, measured in thousands of missions flown and tens of thousands of enemy aircraft destroyed or damaged, represented one of the decisive technological and tactical advantages of the Second World War. April 15, 1943, the date, means nothing to most, but to those who flew and fought in the skies over Europe, it marked a turning point. Oberleutnant Hoffmann survived that first encounter with the P-47 Thunderbolt, nursing his damaged Focke-Wulf back to base with his hands shaking and his wingman dead. In the ready room that evening, the laughter had stopped. The massive American fighter they had dismissed as a flying bathtub had just rewritten the rules of aerial combat, and the Luftwaffe would spend the next 2 years learning that lesson in blood and fire. 15,483 P-47 Thunderbolts were built before production ended. More than any other American fighter except the P-51 Mustang, they flew over 546,000 combat sorties, destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, and claimed over 9,000 more destroyed on the ground. The numbers are staggering, but they barely capture the human reality. Each sortie represented a pilot climbing into the cockpit knowing he might not return. Each victory meant another man falling from the sky, and each loss was a family receiving a telegram they would never forget. The P-47 was never the most elegant fighter, never the most graceful or romantically styled. It was brutally functional, a hammer designed to smash through enemy defenses and absorb punishment that would have destroyed lesser machines. But it was exactly what the Allies needed at the moment they needed it most. When the 8th Air Force stood on the edge of defeat in late 1943, unable to sustain the losses from unescorted missions, the Thunderbolt provided the solution. When the invasion of Europe demanded absolute air superiority, the P-47 delivered it. When advancing armies needed close air support to break fortified positions, the Thunderbolt came screaming down from the clouds with bombs and rockets and 850 caliber machine guns that turned German columns into burning wreckage. The echo of those guns, that distinctive ripping roar, faded into history in 1945, but the legend endures. The German pilots who laughed at the ungainly American fighter learned their lesson too late, and many never lived to pass it on. The P-47 Thunderbolt had proven that, in modern warfare, firepower and protection mattered more than elegance, that industrial might could overwhelm tactical skill, and that sometimes the best weapon is simply the one that refuses to die and keeps fighting until the enemy breaks. That was the Thunderbolt's legacy, written in the skies over Europe in lead and fire and the courage of the men who flew her into battle.